Over and over the ice crawled down from England to cover much of Central Europe and then retreat. Each time the ice came, the Neanderthals retreated to an ever-shrinking refuge on the Iberian Peninsula. There they struggled to survive. Eventually there was a last. There is always a last. Like individuals, species too die. A short, stocky male was hunched over a tortoiseshell cradled between his crossed legs. The pair of yearling horse tibia bones in his hands whirred against the domed carapace. Their clacking circled around a central double beat. His eyes were squeezed shut against the sweat pouring from his hairline. The droplets plowed damp streaks over his corrugated brow and through the painted stripes on his forehead and cheeks. His reddish beard was stained with charcoal and white clay. He was part human, part animal, part darkness, part spirit. His posture favored a twisted right leg projecting at an unsettling angle from his hip. Everyone present knew of his painful hopping walk and the grimace that crossed his broad face when he took a step. Everyone knew his differences, his wrinkled brows and short arms. They knew as well that he had become one of them, and they cared for him as a beloved of their own. His large upper teeth gripped his lower lip, which writhed in frenzied concentration. On the opposite side of the low burning fire stood a taller man with roughly cut dark hair breathing into a crane's delicate leg bone, his long fingers dancing over a series of holes drilled into it. Shrill wailing rose, shivered, and stepped downward only to rise again. The turtle drum articulated the tock-tock-tock of cranes into flight. The stocky drummer playing it growled. Voice and whistle trilled a crane's mating. Other times the delicate bone shrieked the red deer's screeching cry or the peep-peep-peep of a crane resting, and the drummer would answer with a great bison's growling threat. Animals passed through the two men conversing with one another. The one with the flute stared into the darkness over the head of the drummer, for it was there in the darkness that the spirits prowled. An old woman squatting nearby scraped a willow wand against a series of grooves carved on the side of a horse's scapula, forcing the double beat. Her gray hair was greased into a fan behind her head. Her mate crouched before her, head bent toward the embers. Fire tinted his thinning hair with irregular pulses of red and shadow, pulses of heat, of fear, of hope. He was seer, the conduit, the opening. This gathering was for him. In the rare moments of silence between beats, when there was no whistle from the flute and the scraping on the scapula stopped, Seer barked short, harsh rasps, so low the woman and the others leaned down to hear. A soft breeze set the leaves in the trees around them shifting and sighing, another pained breath in the night. The others would look at the two musicians, and the trilling clatter, the warble, the scrape would start up again. An invisible crowd was gathering out of the shadows, the fire, the breeze, the rasping breath, the trees. They came from the water, from the sky. Slowly the embers sank back into themselves and pulled over themselves a covering of white dust. A pale blue light began to wash away the stars. The moment the sun appeared, the man with the flute flowed to his feet, tilted his head, trilled out a series of shrieks, hopped sideways once, and with one long scream from the flute froze in place, a foot in the air. He was Crane. The drummer, still bent low over the tortoise shell, threw aside his drumsticks, scooped some ash from the fire's edge and rubbed it over his face, further blurring the painted stripes. The quiet stretched, taut as a deer hide tied out to dry under the rising sun. This time, instead of the breeze and the rasping breath, There was only the low gurgle of tide flowing into the estuary. A circle of light appeared beneath the hills over the water where the darkness lingered. It pulsed the same way the embers had changed color on Seer's hair. Like all things, it was alive as the embers had been alive. All could feel this brilliance beating with the man's pulse. This was the way blood throbbed from a deep cut in a deer's neck, the way it throbbed in the head when danger suddenly threatened. The globe, white mist, floated upward, stretching down into the form of a human being, neither man nor woman. It shifted, became a lion, a bear, or a human with a bison's head. The shining creature stared from the darkness, from the pulsing of its own light. Everyone there froze in place, at once terrified and elated. The sun floated higher, and the creature faded from sight. People stirred, shook their heads, looked at one another in amazement. Someone laughed nervously, and life came back. The sun was full in the sky. The day would be a fine one. Seer arched his back. Cords stood out on his neck, and his hands curled into fists. He slumped with a barking cough and drew a long, shuddering breath. After a moment collecting himself, he looked sideways at the old woman. She set aside her scraper and touched his face with the backs of her fingers. She leaned down and sniffed at his breath. He pushed her away. "I saw," he whispered. "Winter will be hard, harder than last. Dark spirits there, beyond the sound. We must go south all the way to the other sea. There we will find some safety." The old woman sat back with a grunt. She looked up at Crane standing on one foot, flute in hand. "We are grateful to you, Crane." She nodded at the twisted one. "And to you, drummer." Her voice was soft. Seer breathed easier now. "I did not see all of us there." He spoke as if to himself. One was missing. Drummer lifted the tortoise shell from the hollow of his legs, and after setting it aside with a long sigh, slumped forward, eyes closed. After a moment he gave a feeble grin. Crane put his foot down and shook his head. "Was I?" Drummer held himself up with one short, thick arm. "Spirit was here. Bison and deer were here." Crane bowed his head. "Good." He slid his flute into a pouch at his side. "We brought them, the spirits," he said to the old woman and her mate. "Drummer and I, we brought them. It is to them you should be thankful, not to Drummer, not to Crane. Bison brought the knowing. Bighorn deer brought the knowing. They heard us, and they came." The 11 people present murmured. They heard, and they came. Crane and Drummer touched their lips with their fingertips and spat onto the cooling fire. The others, the invisible ones, the voiceless ones, the ones with neither taste nor touch, withdrew from the camp. Only the people remained seated around the cooling ashes. Seer sipped water from the old woman's wooden cup and gently pushed it aside. "I'm fine," he said. "The darkness is gone." The old woman put the cup on a nearby flat stone and stood. "I greet deer. I greet bison," she said. "I thank Crane, who flew down from the north to help us. I thank them all, and the others whose presence we felt, who came this night to help. Not all of us are there next warm season." "We do not ask who will not be there," the old woman said gently. "We do not ask. That is for the next cycle. It could be me," she meant to say. "I am near to death. So is this elder, my mate." Later she fed Drummer, for he could not walk well and could not carry his own food. She gave him some dried deer meat, some greens from the creek, and a leather pouch filled with nuts they had cached nearby the year before. "This day will be warm and long," she told him. "It is the warm season, and the day will be long." He could see that for himself, but it was important for her to speak it, for speaking made it so. "I remember others like me," he said. Yes, others. His speech was hesitant and slurred, but she could understand. Still, she didn't reply to this, for he said it often, and there was no reply. Instead, she changed the subject. "It's a fine day to wade in the salty water and search for shellfish. A fine day to throw the nets we've been making through the warming season over the water and bring out the fish. When we have done this, I will bring you some." But he would not be put off. "I remember others like me," he repeated. "Oh no, not with my leg, not like that, but short, like me, and slow, but not as slow as me." "They're gone," she said slowly. "We have seen none like you, not in a long while, not since my mother's day. The day you came to us, drummer, I was young. I had a child then. Crane. You hobbled into our camp. You were hungry, so hungry. You didn't speak." She paused, lost in reminiscence. "There was no one else. No one came after you." She trailed off. After all, this too they had said before, many times, once he began to speak. "But I remember them." His thick voice was uncertain. She thought he repeated this phrase over the years, so he would remember them. Saying made it so. "A woman," he said, "a man, others." She stood and brushed invisible dust from her wrapping of light deer hide. "Only you, drummer, no one else." She walked away. He knew there was someone because he could see inside his mind. He was small. It was raining hard just outside, a broad, flat sheet of rain across the shelter entrance, hiding the valley, the opposite hillside. It was raining, but he was dry. Fire kept them warm. The men all seemed so big, but now he knew they were short, as he was, with eyes set deep beneath thick brows. His people paid little attention to him back then. He was underfoot. There were 2 other children with the group, but they were older. A woman fed him. She wasn't tender. He didn't remember her with affection, but she gave him food, and that was enough. There was not much affection among his people, not like the people here. That was the night of the great rains. Fire flared up. It was growing dark. The sheet of rain reflected firelight in the glistening red streaks. Suddenly everyone was shouting. The men grabbed their spears and ran into the rain. The women followed, disappeared into the darkness, and he was alone. He waited. He remembered waiting. He was patient, always had been, but he was hungry, and after waiting he looked for food. He found some, too, and pools of water left over from the rain. Days passed. He didn't know how many. He dreamed through the day. This was called remembering. He was very small. The fires went out, and he was cold. There was no more food. It came to him that he should follow his people, and so he set forth from the shelter. There was a stream, and he followed it down. There was plenty of water, but no food. Walking was slow for him. The others, they had been much faster. His leg hurt sometimes, and he stopped to rest. Once he saw the great hulk of a rhinoceros grazing in a small glade beside the stream. He didn't remember its name. He supposed he didn't know because he was small. It had great shoulders covered with long hair. Since joining the people, he had seen many, and always fear opened in his belly when he saw one. Then, though, in his memory, he was about to ask the beast if it had seen the others, and something stopped him. The beast glared at him with tiny eyes, long strings of grass hanging from its mouth. He became afraid and understood that it would not tell him about the others, that it would hurt him. He crossed to the other side of the stream and continued. The old woman touched his shoulder, and he roused from his reverie. She handed him some smoked fish. He ate, grateful as always. The warm periods are shorter than when I was young, she told him. The cold cuts deeper. This, too, she had said many times. The old always say things were better when they were young. He pulled a fish bone from his mouth and probed it between his large, square teeth. She nodded several times, thinking it over. Perhaps it's true. She was distracted looking at him, thinking of Seer's words, "I did not see all of us there." Drummer moved more slowly this year than last. His gait was more awkward. The way south through the mountains was hard, and the mountains were bitter cold this time of year, even under the sun. She and Drummer were seated on the grassy bank of the estuary. Sunlight dappled on the water. Long-legged cranes dotted the far shore, their necks jerking forward and back. Drummer's twisted foot trailed in the water. The old man came and sat beside her. "How's my son?" he asked, looking at Drummer with a lopsided grin. The old woman knew this grin could not conceal his fear, his grief. Of course he was not one of Drummer's fathers. When Drummer came to them, he had a name. Besides, the old man was already one of Crane's fathers, perhaps even his sire. It didn't really matter. He was a good hunter and provided for her and the two boys. Most of all, though, he was the one of the group who knew what was becoming manifest in the world and could speak the truth of it. His words, after the long night of whistling and drumming, the longest night in the cycle of warm and cold, were always true. When Drummer appeared and she and Seer took him in as one of their own sons, the old man became one of Drummer's fathers as well. He treated both boys the same. Already before Drummer, he had been teaching Crane the ways of the spirits. Drummer pounded on things since he could hold a stick, so the old man apprenticed him as well. The four of them could summon all the spirits, the animals, air, and water, the white light spirit from the mist and night. So Drummer became his as much as Crane. She touched the old man's arm fondly, knowing these things and seeing the sadness in his smile. After Drummer appeared, not all Crane's fathers had felt the same way about him. Many spurned the newcomer as an awkward misfit, both strange and a stranger. One of the fathers suggested roughly they leave him in the forest. They didn't want him. He would only slow them down, so he said. Besides this old man sitting here, only one of the other fathers still traveled with the band, but he was out hunting most of the time and seldom around. The old woman was pleased the others had drifted away to other groups and had not reappeared. Supposedly one had gone far north to the ice itself, but this she did not believe. He was a lazy man who liked fire warmth and ripe fruit too much. They started south. On the way it came to pass as the old man had foreseen. Though the old woman protected Drummer as best she could and helped him along as they made their way to the other sea, he slipped on a mountain trail, sending loose stones flying from under his awkward foot. With a startled cry, he tumbled from the path and disappeared into the mist below. They looked down into it for a long time before moving on. As far as we know today, the Neanderthals were gone by around 40,000 years ago, leaving modern humans as the last hominin standing. We do not possess the wisdom or vision to see how long we will continue to endure, but from now on history belonged entirely to the human species.